talk about school breakfast. Let's first talk about serving options for school breakfast. There's a variety of ways you can serve your breakfast. There's the traditional option, which is when students eat in the cafeteria as they arrive at school in the morning. There's an alternative way to serve breakfast. That would be a grab and go option where students pick up meals and then eat in their classrooms. Offering a second chance breakfast after the bell between class periods and providing students a time to eat or eat in the next class is also an option. So consider offering different serving options to not only help increase breakfast participation, but give students every opportunity to start the day off with a nutritious meal. So up next on the slide, you will see the breakfast meal pattern. The full chart of the breakfast meal pattern requirements was provided in your handouts. It's also available on our website. And if you're new to planning breakfast meals, we recommend you print this chart and read through it. I want to take note on the vegetable and meat alternate components. As you can see, they are not required at breakfast, but they can be served. We're going to cover this a little bit later in the slides. You can see that the meal pattern requirements are broken down by grade groups. So let's talk a little bit about the meal pattern. Breakfast consists of 3 required components. Those components are grain, fruit, and milk. At a minimum, 3 components must be offered, but more can be served. Menus must contain at least 1 grain serving, and then you can offer a meat alternate and it would credit as a grain. So just like lunch, there are 3 required grade groups and there is overlap so that a single menu can be used for all grade groups at breakfast. For grains, besides the daily minimum, there are weekly requirements for each grade group. So to plan a K through 12 menu, for example, you would plan a minimum of 9 grains for the week, but to keep it simple, if you plan 2 grains daily, you would be compliant for all grades. I also want to talk about and review some breakfast terminology because the terminology for breakfast is a little different than lunch. Breakfast menus are based on required meal components, but recognized as food items on the tray when determining a reimbursable breakfast. Again, a food component is one of 3 required food groups: grain, fruit, and milk. A food item is a specific food offered with one of 3 components. So for example, 4 ounces of juice and 1/2 cup of pears. These are the same component, but they are 2 items. So when planning, you must offer all 3 required food components in order to have offer versus serve at breakfast. The menu planner must offer 4 food items. A reimbursable tray, when it gets to the POS station, must have 3 items on the tray. This is a little different than lunch because lunch is based off 3 food components. So it's important that the cashier recognizes a reimbursable meal and needs to be trained for both breakfast and lunch. This may require you to explain how items count towards at breakfast. Let's look at an example with the grains before we review each component. So at breakfast, you could serve a double portion of the same grain item and it counts as 2 food items. So in the example you see on the screen, I can serve 2 pieces of toast to count as 2 grain servings and 2 items. Or I can serve a large bagel that credits as 2 grains, and this would be 2 items. Let's move to the meat alternate. As I mentioned on your handout, you'll notice that there are no requirements to offer a separate meat alternate at breakfast. But if you choose to offer menu items that contain meat alternate, they must be served with a grain. A meat alternate is known as a grain substitute when counting your grains for the weekly requirements. So the menu planner can plan to serve a meat alternate such as eggs, sausage, or yogurt, but it must be served along with a grain item. The two items paired together then count towards the weekly grain requirement. So an example, cereal and yogurt. This would credit towards 2 grains for the day. Or a breakfast sandwich. A breakfast sandwich could credit as 2 grains and 1 meat alternate, which would be 3 grains towards the weekly requirement. You can also offer meat alternate items and consider them extras. But remember, when planning breakfast, you do have to count all items towards the nutrient standards. So you'll want to watch the frequency of these meats, cheeses, and breakfast items. Let's move on to fruit. So juices must be 100% fruit juice, and no more than half of the fruit offered per week can be in the form of juice. This is easy when you plan for half a cup of fruit juice and half a cup of fruit each day. Keep in mind that frozen varieties should not contain sugar, and canned fruit should be packed in its own juice or in light syrup. As we continue on, the daily requirement for fruit is 1 cup. So to help reduce plate waste, we recommend offering varieties of fruits and juices daily. Plan for 1/2 cup portions, at least 2 different choices each day. And remember, for a reimbursable breakfast to be claimed, the student must have 1/2 cup of fruit on their tray. As the menu planner, you must allow students to take a full cup of fruit if they want. If you plan for 1/2 cup of juice and 1/2 cup of strawberries, they can take both items. But the decision is up to you whether you allow them to take 2 juice boxes. You can also use signage to help students understand what is offered as part of the reimbursable breakfast. As we move on to vegetables, again, on your handout, there's no requirement to serve vegetables at breakfast. Vegetable choices at breakfast could include vegetables in a burrito or a commodity salsa. So anytime you can fit them in, that's great. Again, when we look at grains, you're required to meet not only a daily, but a weekly minimum for grains, and you can always serve more. So daily requirements for grades K through 12 is 1 ounce. Weekly, grades K through 5 is 7 ounces. Grades 6 through 8 is 8 ounces. Grades 9 through 12 is 9 ounces. And remember, a week is equal to 5 days, like Donna already mentioned, and all grains offered at breakfast must be whole grain rich. Milk must be offered at a daily minimum requirement of 8 fluid ounces for all grades. The milk must be served as a beverage, and schools must offer at least 2 choices. Again, those are unflavored, skim or 1%, or flavored skim milk. So as we wrap up the breakfast, let's talk a little bit about some of the important points. Portion sizes for fruit is 1 cup. All grains offered must be whole grain rich. A reimbursable breakfast must contain at least 3 items and must have half a cup of fruit or veggie if you're substituting the vegetable for a fruit. And that is the end of the breakfast part. I'm going to hand the slides over to Sean.
Thank you, Allie. Now we're going to talk about the USDA nutrient standards for breakfast and lunch that must be met as part of the meal patterns. So on the slide, we can see that there's weekly average requirements for calories, sodium, and saturated fat. There is also the daily requirement that the food items that are offered be free of trans fat. In your packet, your handout packet, the USDA nutrient standards for breakfast and lunch are listed, and we are going to go through each one of the weekly average requirements next. So if you would want to pull that out, it will be helpful as we review these requirements. And so, Allie, would you go on to the next slide? So let's take a look at the calorie requirements for breakfast and lunch. As you can see on your handout page, there are minimum and maximum calorie levels identified for each grade group. And so we can see that for lunch, there is a range for grades K through 5, grades 6 through 8, a range for grades 9 through 12. And then if you are planning menus for K through 8, there is the overlap. And so we can see that for grades K through 8, the overlap is planning menus that on average contain 600 to 650 calories. Now, as we look at grades 9 through 12, we can see that that range increases because we are offering our 9 through 12 larger portion sizes. When we look at breakfast, we can see that there is an overlap for grades K through 12, with the range being 450 to 500. So these are minimums and maximums. And as you meet meal pattern requirements with portion sizes for the specific grade groups, your menu should meet the calorie requirements. So let's move on down to the next slide, where we're going to be talking about sodium. And as we look at what's in our handout for school year 2021 to school year 21-22, schools need to meet the target 2 sodium levels, but schools can request a waiver that would allow flexibility to serve meals that meet the target 1 levels. And this is granted through USDA, and we will be releasing that waiver that schools can apply for meeting level 1 requirements very soon. And the reason that USDA is allowing this flexibility in meeting level 1 requirements, which are less restrictive than level 2 requirements, is because of the availability of food products this school year. There may be disruptions in the supply chain, as well as going back to those flexibilities if schools need to provide remote learners non-congregate meals, that many of those products that would be in those meals for non-congregate meals may be higher in sodium. So this is a great flexibility that USDA is allowing. And so when that waiver comes in your email, you want to probably complete it and submit it, because it does allow the menus to be a little higher in sodium for this coming school year. And so as we look at the requirements on sodium, we can see what the target levels for this upcoming school year would be for target 1 with applying for the waiver. And this is what a menu planner, sodium is what is an item that menu planners have control of, because, you know, to meet the target 1 standards, you still need to be aware of the items that you are offering your students. So the frequency of offering higher sodium containing condiments, vegetables. In the chat box, someone had asked about olives, and olives are considered a vegetable under the other category. So would pickles. And those items, of course, are going to be higher in sodium. And so as a menu planner, you would want to consider the frequency and quantity of offering those types of items, because you have to keep in mind you have these nutrient standards also to meet besides meeting meal pattern. So let's move on to the next category. The next slide would be limits on unhealthy fats in the menus. And so meals cannot contain added trans fats. And so looking at the labels of the items that you receive, typically anymore, I do not see any added trans fats to food items that schools purchase, but it's something you need to be checking as items come in, and make sure your vendor knows that anything that you order needs to be free of trans fats. And so that would be looking at any sort of processed baked items you would receive, perhaps your margarine or shortening that you would receive, just being aware that they need to be trans fat free. Also, menus cannot contain more than 10% of the calories from saturated fat. And so looking to ensure that you're maybe limiting or monitoring the amount of cheese, perhaps whole fat, or even 2% items such as cottage cheese, the sour cream maybe that you're using in your menus. So being aware of that. So these are items that menu planners have control of, which include the sodium and fat. So let's move on to the next slide. So meals served over a 5-day week must meet the specific nutrient calorie standards. And so as we look at that, maybe a day may be a little bit over, but on average, we're looking at a week worth of menus. And so what's on your handout is the average. And so if menu planning, based on required portion sizes and food components, these should fall within the nutrient guidelines. Items that are high in calories, fat, and sodium must be limited to ensure compliance with the nutrient standards. Menus must be supported by nutrition facts labels, product labels, recipes, and product specification information. All very important to have and retain on file. And then menu planners may ensure compliance by utilizing USDA approved software if they are choosing to do their own nutrient analysis of their menus. This is not required, but some of our larger school districts choose to provide the nutritional information on their menus to their households. It's not a requirement, but you must use approved USDA software if conducting a nutrient analysis. Next slide. So let's talk about what you need to retain on site. So what product labels are required to be on file? And so this is an example on the slide of what I would say almost perfect label, because it contains nutrition facts. The item is child nutrition labeled, as you can see in the lower right hand or left hand corner, by the box that has the CN in the 4 corners. It tells me the ingredients of the product. It tells me the item number, the weight of the case. So in my world, this would be an ideal label. Now, as you can see, it looks like this label was cut from a box, okay? And we would ask that you keep this label, and you may want to scan it or copy it instead of keeping this label because it takes up space. And you need to keep these labels organized for the school year. And if we would be requesting your records, we would ask that you scan them to us. In the past, we've received boxes of labels taken right from the product, and that's fine, but for your ease in filing and retaining, a copy is sufficient. We don't need the actual label from the box, just a copy of the label. So let's move on to the next slide. So product label information, we're looking for that ingredient statement, we're looking for the nutrition facts label. If the item is CN labeled, we need that information. You need that information because you need to know how the product contributes to meeting meal pattern, especially for your entrees, your prepared entrees, perhaps your grain items, how they contribute to meeting meal pattern. And not all items are going to be CN labeled. It is a process that a manufacturer submits, and it costs that manufacturer of the item to have their product CN labeled. In the absence of a CN label, you would need what's called a product specification statement. And that product specification statement needs to be on company letterhead. It needs to contain information about the credible ingredients, how those ingredients contribute to meeting meal pattern, and it needs to be signed by a company representative. And we're going to look at an example of a product specification sheet as a little bit later. So let's move on to the next slide. So that ingredient statement on your products is very important. As Donna spent some time with you earlier today, you need to ensure that the products that you are serving on your menu are whole grain rich. So all items offered this year for grain need to be whole grain rich. And so we're looking for that information on your ingredient label, as well as if you have any students that have special diets that perhaps you need to be aware of the ingredients in a product. So the question came up in the chat that, we have a student that has to follow a gluten-free diet. Well, I need to look at that label to ensure that there isn't any grain products on that label that student can't have. And so if I'm looking at this whole grain chicken nugget, right away I see that this product contains whole wheat flour, and I would know that it would not be appropriate for my gluten-free student. And schools deal with a lot of special diets, and reading that ingredient label is key. That's your responsibility once you receive that medical statement that would indicate if a student can't have a certain ingredient. So let's move on to the next slide. Nutrition facts label, very important, because once again, remember I mentioned those nutrient standards, and we're looking at how that item contributes nutritionally. I'd be looking at the sodium content, I would be looking at the fat content, and I would be looking at ensuring that product is trans fat free. So important information on our nutrition facts label. Next slide. child nutrition label. And once again, a child nutrition label is kind of like the gold standard for telling you how an item contributes to meeting meal pattern. And it is a very distinctive label that is issued by USDA, and we can see that it's in the rectangle shape. We have CN on all four sides. It tells me what the serving size is and how that item contributes to meeting meal patterns. So in this example, we have a 4.5 ounce chicken stir fry bowl, and it provides 1.5 ounce equivalent of meat and 1 ounce equivalent of grain. And that equivalent before grain tells me that it's a whole grain rich product. And it provides some credit for our vegetables. It tells me that it contributes to the dark green vegetable, the red orange vegetable, and it even contains some other category of vegetable. So this is a great label. But as I said, not all products will have a CN label. And can't overemphasize enough, if you are purchasing a product and you are putting it on your menu and you are ensuring that you meet the meal pattern components, you have to have that information before putting the item on the menu, how it contributes. Because if you are reviewed, we are going to be asking for that information, because part of participating in the school meals program is ensuring you meet the meal pattern requirements. So let's move on to that product specification sheet and what you need to be looking for. This is an example in your handout packet. I kind of cut and sliced this one to get it on the slide, but we're looking for that specific information of what the product is. We're looking at who the manufacturer is. We're looking at what is the credible food component. And in this example, we're seeing that it's the chicken, so the meat alternate. It's telling me that the ounces per raw portion of credible ingredient is 3.04. And it's telling me also then how it credits. So my 3.4 ounce serving credits as 2 meat alternate. It is signed by the company representative and it's dated. And I would keep this information in my file that shows me how this product contributes. Now, who would you get this information from? Your vendor. This would be asking your sales representative for this information prior to ordering the product. Sometimes it's available on company websites, but just be assured that your salesperson should be providing this information as you prior to ordering the product. Next slide. Okay, we're going to be talking about offer versus serve next. So we're moving on from the nutrient standards to offer versus serve. And I know we had some questions earlier in the chat concerning offer versus serve, and hopefully we'll get those questions answered as we look at offer versus serve. So what is offer versus serve? Well, you are offering all food components to the student, which is a requirement. And under the offer versus serve option, which for K through 8 is a school's decision, highly encouraged by our office to allow students to make the decision of what food components that they will eat at the table. It is required for, typically it is required for 9 through 12 grades at lunch, But remember, we have that flexibility from USDA if needed for 9 through 12 for non-congregate meals, not to do offer versus serve. It's optional at breakfast for all grades, but highly encouraged by our office. So let's move on down to the next slide. And so offer versus serve allows students to decline food items. It was introduced by USDA to help prevent and minimize plate waste. It's highly encouraged for schools to offer versus serve, and within that to offer choices for students to select different food components. So, so within a food component, perhaps it's offering choices within that component. So students like choices. We all like to be able to have choices. And with offer versus serve, it should improve customer satisfaction because students, if they are able to select the food items that they will eat, they typically will consume those after selecting them. So let's move to the next slide. So what's the basics of offer versus serve? All required food components must be offered to the student in full portion size requirements. The meal must be priced as a unit. So no matter if the student takes at lunch, for example, 3, 4, or 5, all of the food components, the meal is priced the same. The student decides which items to decline. So all food items have to be offered, but it is the student's decision which food component that they wish to decline. So an example would be, often we see in milk where school personnel think, well, the student has to take milk, but milk is a food component. If the student doesn't want to take milk, then they can decline it. But it has to be offered. Milk is milk. It can't be substituted. You have to offer milk. Unless there's a medical statement that would prohibit that, but that would be for a student that has a special diet. And so let's move on to the next slide. So at lunch, a reimbursable lunch under offer versus serve must contain at least 3 different food components. And one of those must be, at a minimum, a half a cup of fruit, vegetable, or a combination of fruit and vegetable. So that has to be on the student's tray. So a student could take milk, they could take one, for high school, they could take their 2 servings of grain, and they would have to take at a minimum a half a cup of fruit and or vegetable for a reimbursable meal. A reimbursable breakfast must contain at least 3 food items, okay? One must be at least a half a cup of fruit and or vegetable if vegetable is being offered. So a student has to leave the line with at least these minimums on their tray. Moving on to the next slide. Students pay full price for the meal, whether it contains 3 or 5 components. And the cashier, your point of service person, that person that is at the end of the serving line, has to be able to recognize that the student has a reimbursable meal. They are a key player in the food service operation. And so as a food service director or manager, you need to be communicating with your cashier how food items contribute to meeting meal pattern. This would be like your entree items. They need to know if they credit as the grain and meat component. So that is key to communicate with your cashiers. You can't assume they know how an item contributes. So just ensuring that they have that basic understanding of how items contribute, and they are aware that that student has to leave with at least that half a cup of fruit and or vegetable. They can certainly have more, but they have to have at least that minimum quantity. If the student does not have 3 components, then that cashier should ask the student to go back and select more, or address what, if they don't have the fruit and vegetable, they should be directed back to select a fruit and or vegetable. If the student would refuse to do that, the meal cannot be claimed for reimbursement. It cannot be claimed. The student must be charged a la carte pricing for the items taken. So that's another key issue or point that we want to mention is they have to have a reimbursable meal for that meal to be claimed for reimbursement. Next slide. Typically, as we said, it's mandatory for high school at lunch to do offer versus serve, but there is the waiver in place for school year 21-22 for those instances when a student maybe wouldn't be attending school in person. It's optional for all other grades and highly encouraged by nutrition services, because the last thing we want to see is plate waste. And I'm sure you don't want to see plate waste also. Oftentimes we hear from schools, well, it takes so much time for our younger students to go through the line with implementing offer versus serve. But keep in mind, it's making sure that the student is aware of what the food items that are being offered, and they just need to tell you if they don't want a food item. It's not asking every student, do you want this? Do you want this? It's making sure that the student tells you if they don't want a food item. So schools have found that to be pretty effective, in that perhaps, a teacher tells them before they go through the line what's on the menu, and making sure that they speak up if they don't want a food item. Students must select a fruit or vegetable and may decline up to 2 other food components. So that's the basics. Let's move on to the next slide for breakfast. Required to offer at least a minimum of 3 required components. And with offer versus serve, 4 food items must be offered, and the student can decline 1 item. It's optional for all grades at breakfast, offer versus serve. And next slide. Schools that choose not to implement offer versus serve, which may be our smaller elementary schools or feeding sites that are elementary, all students must leave the serving line with all food components in the required portion sizes if you choose not to implement offer versus serve. So that would be ensuring that all portion sizes, the required portion sizes, and all components are on that tray, which could result in plate waste. And sometimes for younger students, having that quantity of food on a tray can be overwhelming to a student, and that prevents them from consuming their lunch. So it's highly encouraged by our office. Next slide. So I've mentioned how important the cashier is because they're the person that is in charge of the point of service meal count. And the definition of a point of service meal count, or sometimes we refer to it as a POS count, it is that count that is taken at that point in the serving line where it can be accurately determined that a reimbursable meal has been served. And so that has to be after all food components are offered to that student, so that it would be after the end of fruit and vegetable bars where the student is self selecting those items. It needs to be at the end of the serving line after all food components have been offered. The point of service person, or POS person, the cashier, has to be able to identify that that student is present and that they have that reimbursable meal prior to them leaving the serving line. Next slide. Meal counts must be taken at the end of the serving line or that location after all food components have been offered, and that includes milk, and as I have previously said, at the end of the fruit and vegetable bars, because those are all food components. A point of service count can't be taken in the morning prior to the student even having their lunch. Most schools have the ability to be wireless, and so only rare exceptions do we allow a school not to conduct their POS at the end of the serving line, and that's on an individual basis, because in this day and age, most schools can conduct their POS at the end of the serving line or after all food components are offered. Next slide. Another requirement from USDA is that a student has to be able to identify a reimbursable meal. They have to know what they can take. So signage must be displayed at or near the beginning of the serving line. And the purpose of this signage is to identify the food components of a reimbursable meal. And this is not a new requirement. Probably all of you have your signage, but on our website, on the front page, the home page, at the bottom of the page, if you need to request some signage from our office, we ask that you complete a Google form for our office assistant to send out any signage you might need. So if you need a refresher breakfast poster or a lunch poster, you can complete that request and it will be mailed to you. I think right now we're waiting on printing on some of our signage, so there may be a little bit of delay, but there needs to be signage for both breakfast and lunch if you participate in both of those programs, that is posted and visible to students that identify the food components. Next slide. So in your packet, we have some great resources for you on offer versus serve because we just touched upon it today. There's a nice handout that explains offer versus serve for your cashiers. You would want to share that with them. There's a nice one-page, easy to follow handout. And then there's also guidance from USDA on offer versus serve. And these are available under the Forms and Resource section of our website. The link for the offer versus serve manual, you will find there. Or you can Google it just by putting offer versus serve manual USDA. And it's a great resource that goes into further explanation about offer versus serve. So wanted to point that out to you as well as the handouts that are in your packet. Next slide. This is an example of the breakfast signage that we have available. And this is the one I think that's at print right now, but I think there's a quick turnaround time to get that. But that needs to be posted, or if you've created your own signage, that is certainly fine also. This is just some that we provide. Next slide. And we are going to take a break right here to address any questions that you might have before we set you free for lunch. So